Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. And we are happy to welcome back to the program Luca Gattoni-Celli. Luca, welcome back to the show. This is going to be a first time for some of our listeners meeting you, so take a moment here, if you would, and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Thanks, Brian. It is nice to speak with you again. My name is Luca Gattoni-Celli. I am the founder of YIMBY of Northern Virginia. YIMBY stands for Yes in My Backyard. We're part of a national movement, international movement, actually, to reduce regulatory barriers to housing construction to help end the housing shortage and affordability crisis in the United States.
And I'm looking at an article that you've written here, which makes a very strong case here that this is not, this doesn't require any notable ideological commitment, which is good. Because a lot of people, I think, they hear Yes in My Backyard and think, oh boy, here it comes. You know, some bleeding heart do-gooder is here with a solution for me. Talk to me about how this is actually a very conservative solution to a very real problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way I would put it is that the movement is what you make of it. All of this boils down to urbanism. Urbanism is just on a basic level the study of the built environment and how people interact with it. So roads, houses, buildings, bridges, what have you, all the things that little kids like. And this doesn't require any ideological commitments. Really, though, as I assert in the piece, and I really do think this is true, if you kind of force me to kind of take a side or take a stand, I would say that it's fundamentally small L libertarian. I haven't really been able to use libertarian label recently because it's become a lot of kind of tainted. We don't have time to talk about that. But, you know, this is fundamentally a push to deregulate. And the example of what good looks like, what good land use looks like, is pretty close to Norman Rockwell's Small Town America, or, you know, the heyday of American cities in the Gilded Age, where there were great public works and great public spaces. And so that's really fundamentally small cities conservative, I would argue. The examples we have of when we got this right in America are about 100 years old. And then it was during the progressive era that kind of, we embarked on this radical experiment of completely remaking our cities in ways that made them much less hospitable to daily life on foot and in general. So, the point you're raising though is that the people who are in the movement are mostly progressive. I think the simple explanation is that most cities have progressive politics, and the places where the YIMBY movement really started, especially California and the Bay Area and San Francisco in particular. You know, as you go from California and then click all the way down to San Francisco, these are very progressive political spaces where the narcissism of small differences is often in play. And people have a very confrontational style of politics. And so that has carried over a little bit to the YIMBY movement, but I think it's less and less influential. I mean, I started the YIMBY movement, or the YIMBY group in my area, without knowing anything about the national movement. I just knew that I liked the idea, and that's all that mattered, and that's all that matters in our daily work.
There's a magic word that you use too, which immediately got my attention and made me go, oh, wait, I want to know more, and that word is deregulation. Because it seems like a lot of our housing problem that we face is because of over-regulation and endless red tape. Talk to me about the vision that the YIMBY policy agenda includes, and maybe people start to recognize that, hey, this is not boilerplate progressive ideology at work here.
No, quite the opposite. The example I give in the piece of a specific housing regulation that conservatives should focus on reforming is minimum lot sizes. There's a great history of this policy put out by the Mercatus Center's Urbanity Project, which is great research. And obviously they're a center-right institution, and they have a classical liberal background like I do. And minimum lot sizes basically means, the plot of land that a house can sit on or that a building can sit on has to be a minimum size. That policy really became widespread around 1940. It was largely a measure to try to prevent young families from moving in to cities and to towns with the thought that they would they would consume more in public services, especially in the form of public schools, than they would pay in property taxes or taxes in general. And there's also some evidence that these policies were pursued to block Black Americans who were coming north during the Great Migration at that time as well. And the conservatism I grew up with and grew up believing, I really used to consider myself conservative. And now it's just really complicated. But, reading National Review as I did growing up, I put this piece in National Review because I wanted to make the point that these policies are fundamentally a case of government overreach and government failure. Another example I would like to share is we're remodeling a shower right now in a bathroom on the third floor of the townhouse we live in. For some reason, the city permitting office had to perform some kind of archaeological review as part of that. So I don't know how far down the third floor extends into the earth. I don't believe it does at all. But for whatever reason, that was an item on the list. And this is the type of mindless bureaucracy that makes it more expensive to have a good life in America today.
I mean, it leaves you wondering, what would they be looking for? What kind of archaeological significance could there be?
I don't know. We're not doing the toilet, so I can't tell you. But I will say this. There's nothing conservative about that. There's nothing conservative about putting up all these hoops that people have to jump through just to do something as basic as remodel a bathroom. And there's nothing conservative about making housing artificially expensive. It's completely at odds with the ethos of upward mobility and opportunity that really represents the best of conservatism to me personally.
Not to mention the free market, allowing it to function.
And just in general, the idea that people should be able to make a better life for themselves and their families.
You mentioned in your article that as part of that permitting process that you were forced to go through, you actually watched a family politely beg the city for a zoning variance so they could stop sewage from regularly flooding their basement. I mean, that would seem like a no-brainer.
Yeah, that was a separate incident. So this was the first public meeting I ever attended in the city where I live, Alexandria, Virginia, which in general, we do better than most. We're more permissive of building. We're more embracing of growth than other cities in America. But yeah, this first meeting that I went to, Brian, there was this nice starchy couple who live in Old Town. It's the older part of the city. And it's probably they needed to get around a historic district or something. I'm not sure. But they actually hired a land use attorney, one of the top attorneys in our area, to basically make the case to the city to get some kind of exception so that they can make improvements on their property so that their home wouldn't fill with sewage regularly. And everyone was on the same page. Here's the interesting thing to me. Everyone on the council was very supportive. It was smiles and nods all around, It was never really in doubt, but they still had to go through that process. And it still put the government, the local government, in this awkward position. It was, that sort of thing, honestly, is the rule, not the exception. That's what I think people don't understand unless they've had to deal with this directly. And that's one of the reasons housing is so expensive, because we have these dysfunctional processes.
We're down to just a couple of minutes here, but I'd like you to, for the sake of people who want to find out more about the YIMBY movement and really, sink their teeth into it, what are some of the resources you could direct them to better understand the net positive that this movement is promoting?
There's a couple of organizations. So the YIMBY Action Network that my group is a part of, and we are very autonomous, but we're part of that network. And it's been a great help to us. So YIMBYaction.org. And also the Welcoming Neighbors Network. You can use that website to find other YIMBY groups or YIMBY adjacent groups in your area.
Well, I appreciate you, sticking your neck out to make the case that, look, this is not something that conservatives should feel threatened by. In fact, this actually, as you mentioned in the article, brings a lot of conservative values to bear, but also, allows the free market to function as it should. And I think we can all agree, when regulation decreases, our room to breathe seems to increase for some reason.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people have a sense that what we're doing and have been doing for the last 40 years or so in American society isn't really working. And this is part of that. And I hope it offers conservatives some answers to these big questions that they're asking.
Well, the housing shortage and the crisis that attends that is definitely not limited to just one or two areas, and as you point out, it's not even necessarily limited to big cities. It's something looking for a solution, and I hope that this is a train of thought that catches on. Where can people find you and your work so that they can follow you?
I have a Substack blog called Cornerstone. My name is hard to spell, but Cornerstone's really easy, so just look for Cornerstone on Substack.
Okay, very good. Luca, great to visit with you once again. I hope we get to talk again soon.
Thanks, Brian.
Welcome back. This is segment 2 of today's Moving Forward with Young Voices, and we are happy to welcome back to the program Eloy Vera, who joins us as a Young Voices contributor. And Eloy, take a moment and tell us just a little bit about who you are for the sake of those meeting you for the very first time.
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm Eloy Vera. I'm from Argentina. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm in law school here in my city of Bahia Blanca, and I have been an activist in several liberty-oriented organizations over the last few years.
Very good. I'm looking at a wonderful article of yours on Argentina and Brazil, new allies and illiberal weeds in America's backyard. And first of all, I have to ask you, being in Argentina, how are things going under the administration of your president, Javier Milei? I just would love to get your take on, has it been a good thing for your country?
Yeah, it's going very well. Actually, this is the first month, at least for now, that we have hit 0% inflation in food items and less than 2 digits inflation in other stuff. So actually, yeah, the prospects of the economy overall are getting really better, and his numbers are quite positive.
Well, and it sounds like he's on fairly good terms with the West as well, which I'm sure doesn't hurt your situation.
Yeah, I think Milei is changing one of the worst traditions of Argentina politics, that is this sort of North Korea-like defiance for the sake of defiance against the liberal powers that be. And he's, I think, putting us on the right side of history. He's being supportive of Israel, of Ukraine, of the United States, and liberal democracy and free countries in general.
So now let's talk about Brazil. Now, I'll admit I have actually paid quite a bit of attention to Javier Milei. I've not paid as much attention to Brazil, but I understand that the leadership there seems to be taking a slightly different, less friendly toward the West approach. What can you tell me about Brazil's president and his direction?
Well, the main thesis of my article actually is that over the last few years we have seen Argentina bandwagoning Brazil, and that is becoming increasingly unsustainable because even though Milei sort of intensified that democracy and liberalism in some aspects is ingrained into the identity of this country, while in Brazil we have seen over the last few years a wave of populist politicians, either from the right or from the left, who are intensifying this defiance against the United States particularly, but also against the international order, against international law, allying themselves with China, Russia, even just a couple of years before they came to the brink of a military coup. So I think this is a divergence we're going to see more and more over the next few years. You
mentioned the BRICS alignment of countries, and I'm seeing Saudi Arabia, for instance, kind of stepping. It appears they're stepping away from the petrodollar, and I'm just curious: is BRICS poised to play a much larger role in geopolitical affairs?
I don't think so because BRICS is quite a complicated and contradictory alliance. I mean, you can have Saudi Arabia and Iran in the same page, China and India, and overall they don't have a concrete agenda, rather just oppose whatever the U.S. is doing. Actually, Argentina was going to join BRICS. We were on a slate because of our last president had registered us, and when Milei assumed power, one of the first things he did is deciding we were not going to do that. We're not going to join.
But is his alignment with America, is that a departure from not aligning with Western powers? You know, I guess I'm trying to understand the history. Historically, has Argentina pretty much charted its own course?
Yeah, but Argentina has maintained a form of neutrality that has always been quite functional to anti-Western and anti-liberal powers. Obviously, the U.S. has done a lot of bad things as well, like military interventions in the Middle East. It's not about aligning automatically with the West, whatever that is, but about not just assuming whatever position is against the free world. And that was being quite costly for Argentina. For example, our neutrality in World War II, which actually was quite friendly to the Axis, caused us to receive a great deal of sanctions over the next years, and it's part of the economic decline that we face moving forward from that.
Talk to me about the economic power of these respective nations. Let's start with Brazil. My understanding is that at least over the last several years, Brazil has become somewhat of an economic powerhouse. Argentina, I know, went through some very difficult economic times, roughly, 12, 15 years ago, maybe a little more. How are they doing economically? Are they also a rising star?
Yeah, actually, in that respect, I think Brazil was a little more intelligent than us. They were pro-ally in the Second World War, meaning that with the Marshall Plan and all that came after that, they benefited a great deal. And because the other powers in the region, Argentina mainly, declined, we became sort of more dependent. Obviously, Brazil is quite a populous country. They have a lot of natural resources, etc. But they are still quite an illiberal economy. They're closed, protectionist, regulated. Much of the territory is controlled by criminal organizations. So the economic growth is hampered by those factors. And they are still quite dependent on having this sort of captured market in the form of other South American nations becoming their economic colonies, so to speak.
So who is in the stronger position economically at this point? Is it still Brazil, or is that changing?
Currently, they are still, statistically speaking, in the stronger position, but I think we're going to see a sort of stagnation in the next years. And Argentina is, with all these measures taken by Milei to crush inflation, to open up to foreign investment, to release the pressure put from the state on economic forces, I think it's going to shuttle up in the next years, or so we hope here.
So I have to ask, is Brazil's government on very stable footing at this point? Obviously, if they're taking more of an anti-Western stance, I'm curious if they are settled in for the long haul, or is there the possibility that a more Western-friendly government could be, in the near future?
Well, the current president, Lula Silva, actually is his third term. He's quite old, sort of like a Biden situation, so that American listeners might put themselves in that position. So it's not clear whether he will be able or willing to have a fourth term. And actually, because of polarization and because of the lack of leadership in the rest of his party, no one is sure whether there's anyone poised or able to assume leadership after he's no longer able to perform that role.
So what would your advice be for how should the U.S. and its allies treat Brazil, considering that it's currently on kind of an anti-Western course?
I think they should abandon their preconceptions about the region. I think they should embrace the new allies they have, mainly in the form of Javier Milei, and they should make Brazil and other illiberal powers across the Western world realize that defying the international liberal order is not without consequence. You can just go about breaking the law, breaking property rights, etc.
Okay, again, we are visiting with Eloy Vera. He's a freelance journalist and law student from Argentina and also a Young Voices contributor. Eloy, for those who wish to follow you, where can they find you on social media?
They can find me on Instagram or Twitter, X, Eloy Vera Bell, small b and uppercase V.
Very good. Wonderful to visit with you. I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, Brian.
And we are back on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to connect up with Sam Raus, who is a Young Voices contributor. Sam, for the sake of those who are meeting you for the very first time, take a moment here and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a writer with Young Voices and write predominantly about issues including foreign policy, tax policy, financial issues, and the general state of affairs of American politics and culture these days. I'm from the Philadelphia area, have been living there my entire life and attended college in Miami, but now I am home and I am working and writing and figuring out what's going on in this world amid this crazy turbulent election cycle and everything that's going on in our world right now.
I'm glad that we're going to be talking about the election because I'm looking at your article on Real Clear Politics about the ghost of COVID past looms over Gen Z voters. And my understanding is there is a large block of Gen Z voters that will be eligible to vote in this election. Talk to me a little bit about the impact that they might have, and then let's talk about how COVID and the aftermath of the pandemic and the pandemic response may influence those voters.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I believe it's roughly about 40 million eligible Gen Z voters in the cycle, which is no small amount. If you remember the 2020 election cycle, the core swing states that determined who won the election were determined by a few 10,000 voters that swung one way or the other on election day. So certainly a sizable impact, certainly the potential for a huge disruption to this cycle. And what we've seen so far in particularly is a very vocal group of Gen Z. Can't say whether or not it's fully representative of the population that is very, very ideologically progressive. And it's been very critical of the Biden administration on issues regarding Israel-Palestine, environmental concerns. But there's a large swath of ordinary voters. And this falls against all demographics, but I think particularly it's underrepresented among younger voters because younger voters are actually the least likely to vote, that aren't as tapped into politics, that are not following any of these geopolitical issues, and will be voting off of very limited information that they gather on a day-to-day basis. Things like how much do things cost? What has the past 4 years been like? And for most of us, one of those core memories is COVID.
So let's talk about what some of the memories of what COVID brought. And granted, this is going to be some painful memories for some, but what are some of the things that could influence how these Gen Z voters will cast their ballots this coming fall? What are the aspects of the COVID pandemic that may influence their decisions?
Yeah, so myself included, a large swath of Gen Z voters were in the middle or end of high school going into the college years around the time of COVID. And as everyone knows, those are very formative years. Those are important timelines where people develop different social skills, different relationship skills, experience a lot of first experiences in their life, whether it's taking a driver's test, going away from home, learning how to cook and clean that they might have not learned when they were younger, but they got to figure out when they get to college. Those kind of things that were substantially hampered by COVID restrictions, particularly in the Northeast and California, where there was extreme restrictions that shut down schools, shut down in-person social activities, sports, going to a mall to go shopping, whatever it might be, that really negatively impacted people's mental health. And that's been widely documented by now, that people develop extreme levels of social anxiety, depression, and different attention problems because of the impact of moving everything online all of a sudden. And I think we've adapted quite well. I think, in my opinion, the workplace will continue to be very hybrid or remote. I think education will continue to be supplemented through using the internet. We certainly don't need to be printing out tons and tons of pages anymore at school, but we do need to meet people in person. We need to go out and do things in the real world. We need to travel and go shopping in stores where we can actually see what we're buying. And losing that really impacted people and really impacted people's, I think, kind of contrast the pessimism, optimism about our future, how much they trust other people. And that's having really hampering effects on our politics today, our culture today. And I think it's going to spring back up in this election cycle, whether we notice it as clearly or not.
I'm ashamed to admit that because of the time that's passed and other things have distracted me, I had almost forgotten until I read your article and I hear you describing some of the things that these members of Gen Z went through. For some students, for instance, on college campuses, I mean, they were under house arrest. They were paying tens of thousands of dollars for the privilege of being confined to their dorm rooms and not having contact with anybody. Yep. And like you say, everything being online. And so, okay, let's talk about accountability. I think at the state level, we're seeing this in some areas where state officials who especially had really heavy-handed responses to the pandemic have been voted out, and I'll say more responsible, people put in their place. But what about some of the big ones like Anthony Fauci or Gavin Newsom and others? I mean, you point out in your article right now everybody's focused on, Trump was convicted in this hush money case, but the people who really did a lot of measurable damage seem to have skated without any accountability whatsoever.
Yeah, and we're finally seeing Anthony Fauci have faced some accountability in the House hearings, yet you still see, this is just a polarized issue that one entire party and an ideology sees him as legitimately a hero, legitimately cannot be questioned simply because of his credentials. Those same people are completely willing to criticize someone like Trump, even though, he truly was the president. We might not all like him, but so Fauci gets to undergo this kind of godly protection because of his credentials. But I think it's just truly shocking. I still see people that I think I would consider, reasonable opponents on the left, people that I engage with or listen to on the news, that legitimately see a future of the party under Gavin Newsom as a presidential nominee someday or something, completely forgetting all of this damage done, all of the poor decisions made, and just I think it's such a quick rush to, things are better now. We don't do any of, we have no restrictions now. You are not required to wear a mask anywhere now for in most of the country. Kind of just trying to make people forget about it and say, with the information we had at the time, that was the right call. And if we knew then what we know now, maybe we would have made different decisions. I don't think that owes up to the accountability that they need to face. I think that actually there were plenty of people speaking out and saying, this is really having negative, within months we saw it was having negative effects on people's mental health to, I think, a considerable degree comparable to the impacts that the disease might have had on people's physical health. And those things should have been weighed. Plenty of people were speaking out on education and the need for in-person education. Test scores have collapsed across the country. And it's a shame that people are rushing to reach conclusions, because I think a lot of people don't forget it and will remember it when they're voting in November.
And I guess this is the question now that's just burning probably on not just my mind, but listeners' minds as well. Does this mean that there's a likelihood that a good portion of Gen Z could actually swing toward a more conservative line of voting than expected?
Yeah, I wouldn't underestimate it. I can't speak to specific races or candidates. I think there's a whole host of problems Gen Z probably has with somebody like Donald Trump, but on down ballot races, on races for governor elections, absolutely. They're going to remember the school board members that closed the school versus kept it open.
I love the way you put this in the article, and that is that whether the candidates realize this or not, there is a shadow of this pandemic looming over the election. And the ones who acknowledge it and who leverage it, and I like how you talked about, and who actually have accountability. Look, if you made a mistake, own it, and you'll probably find people will be more forgiving. But the ones who could make the most of it are the ones who will actually face it. I wonder how many are going to be taken by surprise.
Yeah, and I even think that there's a willingness to maybe say, I had too much power, and I should relinquish some of that power back to the state legislator. But as we see now, and again with these Supreme Court cases too, there's an unwillingness for legislators to be the true actors, and we're giving so much power to the administrative state. But it could change.
All right. Again, we are talking with Sam Raus. And Sam, where can people follow you on social media?
Yeah, I'm at X at Sam Raus1, and I'm also available on LinkedIn, and I publish a Substack page from time to time.
All right. Really enjoyed your article. We'll have a link to it in the show notes. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. This is our fourth and final segment today. Happy to welcome Jacob Lane back to the program. Jacob, good to catch up with you. For those meeting you for the first time, take a moment and tell us about what you do.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on again, Brian. I am a political and nonprofit consultant. So I help nonprofits and political candidates, mostly in the Midwest, but few across the country with their fundraising and communications efforts. And I'm also a Newsmax insider, so I regularly contribute articles to Newsmax.com.
Well, I'm looking at your article about the community of Danville, Illinois, and an exciting new aquatic center that was built there. And yet I'm getting the impression after I read that article that this may have been more of a white elephant than not. Talk to me about the situation.
Well, Brian, you should know about it, and your listeners should know about it because they helped pay for it. It was taxpayer funded, $13 million taxpayer dollars.
Wow.
And again, I know, so let me put this in perspective. So this is part of the funding that was received from the American Rescue Plan Act, or short for ARPA. What that was go back to 2021 after Biden and the Democrats had both houses of Congress, they passed a $1.9 trillion spending program. And what that program was meant to do, it was meant to accelerate the nation's economy that had been harmed, obviously, by the pandemic and by the forced shutdowns that were imposed upon businesses across the country by both the federal government and state governments. Well, in that package was $350 billion. It was for emergency funding for state, local, and tribal governments. So Danville, Illinois, which is, you're probably wondering why focus on Danville. I'm not picking on Danville. Danville is my hometown. So Danville received $26 million of that funding. And city leaders decided that the best use of that funding, or at least a good chunk of that, 13 million of it, was to build an aquatic park in the town. Now, again, like I said, $13 million, opposed to $1.9 trillion. I know that's a drop in the bucket of misuse of funds, but unfortunately, Danville is part of a larger picture of this misuse of funds that were clearly not directed for pet projects like these.
Yeah, you actually mentioned, several different examples of this: New Jersey, Maine, North Carolina, and maybe there's some comfort in the fact, well, look, everybody else is doing it, but it doesn't change the fact that this is frivolous spending or it's irresponsible spending that nonetheless falls on the back of the taxpayers.
Absolutely. And I mean, you brought up New Jersey. New Jersey spent $15 million for promotional efforts so they could attract the World Cup. Maine spent $20 million to quote unquote modernize fish hatcheries. North Carolina spent $5 million. This one I think is a little funny. For moonshine walking trails. So if you're ever down in North Carolina, maybe you'll get to experience that. But I mean, and again, it's I just don't want to pick on those states either. I mean, Florida spent $140 million. Florida's a red state, and they spent $140 million to build a 29-story luxury hotel. And the most egregious example of the misuse of funds was actually $2 billion was allocated to non-existent county governments in Connecticut and Rhode Island. So lawmakers, Congress passed this bill. They appropriated $2 billion of funding for something that didn't even exist, and not a single member of Congress took the time to see if these entities actually existed. They didn't. And it just goes, like I said, it goes into a wider story of there is just a complete lack of oversight and blatant misuse of these funds. And look, this was passed in 2021. We're only into 2024. And this is so far what legislators have been able to discover that the funds have been spent on. Imagine what we'll be talking about 5 years from now, what funds have been spent on.
So Jacob, tell me this, is there any accountability at this point, or are those state officials who gladly took the money, are they just, going to get off scot-free?
Well, look, I mean, the Republicans obviously took over Congress after the 2022 midterms. Not Congress, excuse me, they took over the House. So there have been a series of investigations into this type of funding. Really, the only thing we can do right now, Brian, is because the checks have been written, the money has already been allocated. It's just to sort of monitor and to investigate this funding. And, to give legislators credit, and I'm not going to give them a lot of credit on this because they don't deserve a lot of credit on this, but they actually put in the legislation that you were supposed to spend this money on one of four categories. And the four categories were responding to the adverse effects of COVID, additional compensation for essential workers, restoring lost revenue, or infrastructure projects like water, sewer, and broadband projects. Now, let's go back to the example in Danville here. Unless water slides now are listed under critical infrastructure, and if they are, that's great. We're going to be a happier world because of it. This is just, I mean, it's insanity, right? I'm going through each of these categories, restoring lost revenue. How in the heck can a water park that's only open 3 months out of the year, because we're in a state that has all four seasons, how can that replace lost revenue? Really? Essential workers? I didn't realize that water park workers were part of essential workers. I always thought that was like paramedics and police and firefighters. That's what I could classify as essential. So
no, your point is very well taken, and yet it seems like there was no hesitation on the part of these either municipalities or states to just put their hand out. Yeah. For whatever their wish list is. Where do we go from here? How do we prevent further abuse of the taxpayer, with projects like this?
Well, I think one legislator put it best. They called it the greatest theft of the American taxpayer dollar in history. And I completely agree with them. Look, I think where we go from this is that, number one, you don't shut down a country because of a quote unquote pandemic. This is look, I think most conservatives would agree that when the federal government or a state government shuts down a business through no fault of their own, so it's not the free market doing this, it's the government saying that you can't operate, and you have thousands of workers affected by that. Yes, we do need to help those folks out, but maybe we can take a lesson from this that's probably not the best first plan of action going forward, right? That, and injecting 1.9 trillion into the economy, it hasn't really worked. Look, I mean, I know the Fed says that inflation is going down, and it has went down a bit since Biden took office. But look, let's face it, most Americans are still having a hard time paying their bills. That's why credit card debt is at an all-time high, because people are living on their credit cards because they just cannot keep up with the rising costs of things. And unfortunately, this program, this 1.9 trillion program, did nothing to alleviate any of that. So I think the one thing we can take of this is, number one, we need a much more oversight of funds that Congress spends. And secondly, too, Republicans need to get a backbone and put an end to things like earmarks and other misuse of legislation like that, so we don't get crazy pet projects like this that the American taxpayer is on the hook for.
And I actually kind of find myself wanting to take it back even one step further, because it seems like a lot of that damage economically can be traced to ill-advised policies undertaken. Well, we got to lock down the economy. We got to tell these businesses to shut down and so forth. And I mean, look, hindsight's 20/20, but none of that prevented people from getting the virus. It eventually spread until it was endemic. I'd like to see that kind of mischief stopped in its tracks as well, so we don't have to deal with the economic problems in the first place.
Well, and I completely agree. And I would tell your listeners, if they want to examine a country that did not adopt draconian lockdowns, take a look at Sweden.
Yep.
Sweden was one of the few European countries that stayed pretty much open for business as usual during the pandemic. Pretty much at the end of the day, they had the same mortality rate and they had the same sickness rate that a lot of other countries did that imposed draconian lockdowns. And, again, I go back to it. I don't think conservatives have a problem helping businesses out that were affected by this, because, again, this wasn't the free market that shut these businesses down. This was the federal government telling them they couldn't operate. This is the federal government coming in and saying, look, you have to cease operations. And basically, oh, yeah, your workforce, well, that's your problem. So I think we're okay with promoting those things. But like you said, the fact that I hope to God that the next time we experience something like this, and again, we probably will experience another one of these in our lifetimes, that the first answer to this is not, let's shut everything down. Well, I think hindsight, like you said, is 20/20, and it has shown that was a very, very, very bad idea for a number of reasons.
Although I just want to make clear, I do agree with you, though, that the oversight of taxpayer funds has to be improved upon here. And you point out in your article, the city of Danville received $26 million, half of which went to this aquatic center, which is only open how many months out of the year?
3 months out of the year, right? And think about this, and then I'll close with this. Danville is facing a ton of problems. Quaker Oats just left the town. That left over 500 good-paying jobs just gone overnight. Think of the critical infrastructure that this money could have been used on to attract industries like Quaker back to Danville. And unfortunately now, we have a water park. That's great, but when the last splash of the season is had, I think a lot of folks are going to look back on this and they're going to say, this was probably not the wisest use of this one-time infusion of cash that could have been used for 20 other better things. Again,
we are talking with Jacob Lane. He is a Young Voices contributor. Where can people find you on social media?
Sure. So you can find me at Newsmax. I write a regular column for our kids. So that's newsmax.com for our kids.